Mr. Eggers, according to the Pew Research Center, trust in government has remained low for most of the 21st century. Only 2 in 10 Americans say they trust the government in Washington to do what's right. So based on your research, could you share with the committee the most prevalent factors that have contributed to such a low level of confidence in the federal government?
So by focusing on interactions and improving this experience is a really important first step. And when those interactions are not good interactions, then people have declining trust. So making the interactions empathetic, inclusive, and very human can have a positive experience. And this can have a cascading impact on the rest of government. And secondly, it's about transparency. Trust can be improved by having much greater transparency around government policy decisions, technology decisions, by openly sharing information on data collection, security measures, privacy controls, and around trustworthiness. The other finding that we found was that while the overall level of trust in government has been declining, when you actually look at trust in individual agencies, there's very, very big discrepancies. There are some federal agencies that are actually highly trusted, and oftentimes those are the agencies that people have the most interactions with. So we can't address the issue of trust and confidence issues in the federal government with a one-size-fits-all approach, because strategies to build greater trust between citizens and law enforcement will entail a bigger focus on looking at humanity in terms of that as a trust signal, while most important for service agencies like the Postal Service are reliability and competency. So the key thing is that agencies really need to focus on what are the signals looking at in terms of where trust is high or low and what the citizen experience looks like, and actually really focus on improving that in the same way that we saw with the VA over the last 6 years.
Well, thank you. This next question is to Mr. Lira and Ms. Dorris. So we'll have you go first, Mr. Lira, then Ms. Dorris. You both have significant experience in government agencies and have tried to address a number of issues while you were there. I'd like you to share with the committee some of the obstacles that you faced when you were trying to drive customer experience transformation to regain the trust that we've just talked about with Mr. Eggers. What are the obstacles that we have to overcome? Mr. Lira?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I would put it in 2 categories. The first and the most dominant are the process blockers. So it is the stated policy of the government, oftentimes supported by statute. It is the willful intent of agency leaders through executive orders and agency planning. And it is inside the process where agencies either get bogged down or move too slowly. Things like logistical matters such as authorities to operate, or going through a procurement process that takes months or even years instead of weeks and days. These are known issues. And the agencies that were able to move the fastest and to make the most progress were they constructed what I would call a leadership spine, essentially a core team of advocates and stakeholders at every level of the organization. So it wasn't enough simply to have a well-motivated CTO. You needed to have equally well-motivated, the procurement officer, and equally well-motivated counsel, so that you can manage the process of getting an agency to move forward. And very rarely, if at all, it was a technology problem. It wasn't, as I said in my testimony, a need to create technology or to invent it, or even in some cases to build it. It was getting things through a process that is tied to a different era. But that leadership spine, I think, is instructive. It's the second big blocker, which can be cultural. Oftentimes when agencies were resistant to change, it wasn't a result of anything more than fear of what it would mean for the workforce, or fear of what it would mean for how they operate through their daily lives as professionals. And when you can address those concerns, it was amazing how quickly all the reasons and blockers could sort of melt away. And so again, that's where I would go back to the principle of a leadership spine. How can we structurally include stakeholders at every level of the organization? Because much like the human spine, if even a single layer is missing, you have an enormous impact on mobility. And the agencies that are able to move the fastest built that with a lot of purpose.
Thank you. Ms. Doris?
Thank you, Chairman Peters, for that question. As you know, I spent many, many years in the government trying to get the government to embrace customer experience. And I think in some ways it's very complex, but in some ways it's very simple, and that is making customer experience a priority at all levels in the government, and actually understanding what customer experience really means. And that's why I spent so much time on kind of definitions and the differences between customer service, customer experience, and user experience. And customer experience really does take into account everything that everybody has mentioned. So making that understanding, making people accountable, leadership to drive that home, putting the customer at the center. Once you have it as a priority, then you can figure out how do you put the customer at the center? How do you have outside-in thinking rather than inside-out thinking? I think the comments made around silos, agencies don't think of things from an enterprise perspective. People think about customer experience and they go right to technology. Contact centers are a critical component to delivering like an end-to-end digital experience, which doesn't get very much airtime, but the integration of contact center data and in-person data and what people are calling about, interested in, and have problems with can actually drive improvements to the digital experience. So with that, I mean, I think it starts at the top and works its way down.
Well, as we start to wrap up the hearing, we've heard a number of ideas from all three of you. So I'm going to ask you here in kind of some final comments. What's your top thing that you think we should do in Congress, in this committee? If there's legislation, whatever action you think we should take. Of all of the ideas that you've put out there and you've written about, I'm going to ask each of you to give me your top idea, something that we should take charge of. I'll start with you, Ms. Doris.
Thank you for that question. I think having a federal chief customer officer to drive these changes and improvements would be my number one, which was really hard to come up with one.
Mr. Eggers?
I would say three real quick ones. First is funding. The funding designated from the Technology Modernization Fund, it's a good start, but more is needed. So, for instance, in just the state government of New South Wales and Australia, they have allocated more than $2 billion in their Digital Restart Fund to accelerate life events and whole of government digital transformation. So I think more funding is needed, more flexibility. You need flexibility in interagency mechanisms to pool funds, second employees from these projects, and then oversight. We can't change what we cannot measure. So the passage of the Customer Experience Bill would be of great help to drive change and other sort of mechanisms we've talked about today.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Lira?
Mr. Chairman, if I could recommend only one item, it would be the robust but purposeful oversight of this committee on progress on these issues. The committee has done an incredible bipartisan job over many years giving agencies the tools. There's some more that need to be added, but seeing that the progress is being followed through on at the agency level. This doesn't necessarily need to be adversarial or about just sort of gotcha and finding anecdotes, but in the spirit of the FITARA scorecard, providing consistent oversight and measurement of progress by federal agencies is actually a tool, and I've seen it firsthand, for the people in the agencies who are driving that change.
Great. Thank you. One final question. As Congress continues to introduce past legislation that addresses various facets of consumer experience, we continue to hear that well-intentioned about some outdated laws, such as the Privacy Act and the Paperwork Reduction Act, can actually impede the ability of federal agencies to enhance customer experience while still respecting privacy and reducing the burden. So to each of you, in your opinion, what are particular aspects of these laws that should be reformed to enable greater service delivery and customer satisfaction? I'll start with you, Mr. Eggers, and then Mr. Lira, and Ms. Doris, you can wrap it up.
I would just say, as we've talked about this whole session, to actually do this well, you need to get a lot of feedback from users, and you need to look to journey mapping. You need to just basically be able to understand what the users are going through in a very, very deep way. And that is how every company and every other government does modern digital today. And anything that impedes that right now needs to be reformed and modernized. And obviously, the Paperwork Reduction Act was passed for a very, very different time. So I think that is the key thing to focus on. Various administrations have looked at this for years, but I don't think we've seen this sort of progress that we really need to do digital and customer experience well.
The laws that you mentioned haven't been reauthorized in the digital age.
Right.
And so there's a great deal of legacy laws there that are no longer relevant to today's world, as Mr. Eggers indicated. In some ways, the Paperwork Reduction Act has become, in practice, the Paperwork Protection Act, because it has inhibited the ability of agencies to move quickly. As you know, Mr. Chairman, there are critical and important equities around privacy and the protection of the citizens against overly abusive processes from agencies. And those equities should be protected in any reform in those areas. But clearly, if the political capital exists to update and reauthorize those bills for this age and for the age going forward, it would do a tremendous amount of good in agencies.
Ms. Doris.
Thank you, Chairman. I agree with both Bill and Matt, and I think that especially the Paperwork Reduction Act has provided agencies with convenient excuses for not collecting feedback over the years that needs to be changed so that we can better understand how the public, businesses, employees, et cetera, are interacting in their experience with the government.
Right. Thank you.